At some point in life, you will suffer. But if you do what's right while you're suffering, it will lead to peace of mind and spiritual maturity. Right now, you can begin to prepare yourself by suffering through small sacrifices. With every decision you make, ask yourself, what would God want you to do? And compare that with what you want to do. When you notice a discrepancy between these two desires, don't immediately rationalize your intentions and justify proceeding your own intended way. Instead, open your mind to the possibility that it is the Spirit of God that is helping you see this discrepancy. You've heard people talk about walking in the Spirit. Those people who do this have learned to, 1, notice their own decisions as they are making them, 2, compare their own desires with their understanding of God's desires, and 3, follow God's will over their own. When you start doing this, you suffer at first because it takes you out of your comfort zone of doing only what you want to do all the time. Everyone is flawed, no one's will is perfect. So anyone who continues to do what they want without consideration for God's will eventually hurt themselves in some way. In fact, the Bible goes further. It says that following your own flawed self-will will lead to destruction. Yes, we will suffer sometimes while we're doing what's right, but we will grow spiritually by suffering for what's right. Here's what the Bible says about this in Romans chapter 8, verses 5 through 8. People who live following their sinful selves think only about what they want. But those who live following the Spirit are thinking about what the Spirit wants them to do. If your thinking is controlled by your sinful self, there is spiritual death. But if your thinking is controlled by the Spirit, there is life and peace. Why is this true? Because anyone whose thinking is controlled by their sinful self is against God. They refuse to obey God's law. And really, they are not able to obey it. Those who are ruled by their sinful selves cannot please God. In Romans chapter 8, Paul explains how we are children of God through Christ. We will receive blessings that the children of God would expect, but it won't be without suffering. In Romans chapter 8, verse 17, it says, if we are God's children, we will get the blessings God has for His people. He will give us all that He has given Christ. But we must suffer like Christ suffered. Then we will be able to share in His glory. You see, Christ always suffered to do what was right by God. None of us are facing a literal crucifixion. Mainly what we face is the suffering that we must endure in choosing God's will over our own. Usually, however, that discomfort is just as brief as the pleasures we get from following our sinful selves. Christ did God's will over His own while facing a crucifixion. Shame on us if we can't suffer through temptation. The Bible says in 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, Christ suffered here on earth. Now you must suffer as He did, because suffering shows that you have stopped sinning. It means you have turned from your own desires and want to obey God for the rest of your life. We have short-term suffering when we pass up our sin temptations, but if we persevere through these small sacrifices, we will grow spiritually. And this type of growth is what is really needed to face life's most severe difficulties and even death. That's why James says in the book of James, chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, my friends, be glad if you have a lot of trouble. You know that you learn to endure by having your faith tested, but you must learn to endure everything, so that you will be completely mature and not lacking in anything. If we can obey God, especially through tough times, we show our maturity and we grow spiritually. This is the most important type of growth you can have, and you get that growth by obeying God despite your adversities and suffering. I haven't heard many preachers address this topic of suffering, but in my own reading of the Bible, this topic has stood out as a prevailing theme. It isn't easy to compare each of your decisions with God's will, but it's mainly most difficult at first when you're starting to make the change. The more you grow spiritually by obeying God's will, the easier it will become, because you begin to see things more like God sees them, the correct way. The very temptations that had you in bondage will lose their power of seduction with each consecutive time you suffer to abstain, suffer to do right. I hope this article has been an instrument to spread God's message. Take care, and God bless you.